Greetings, this is Chapter 5, Affirmative Action, and I have to tell you that Affirmative Action, or Executive Order 11246, is probably one of the most misunderstood, misrepresented pieces of employment law that is out there. I think the media misunderstands it. It's not communicated clearly. Everybody assumes it's about quotas, which it is not. So we will get into how executive orders are different than laws. We will talk a little bit about what the executive order is about, and how we can make sure we are in compliance with that executive order. There are 8 learning objectives for this particular chapter. Number 1, discuss what affirmative action is and why it was created. So we'll understand a little bit of the history of what affirmative action is in the context of this executive order, and why we have it, why it's needed. Number 2, provide the results of several studies indicating why there continues to be a need to take more than a passive approach to equal employment opportunity. Affirmative action is, by definition, making an affirmative decision to act, to create more opportunity in your workplace. And so we'll talk about how those two things align, EEO and affirmative action, why they are not in conflict with each other, but they actually work very nicely in alignment with each other. Number 3, name and explain the 3 types of affirmative action. Number 4, explain when affirmative action plans are required and how they are created. Number 5, list the basic safeguards put in place in affirmative action plans to minimize harm to others. So again, all of these things help us realize that affirmative action isn't just about quotas, right? It's a much more complex piece of policy that we need to adhere to. We can do this voluntarily, obviously, or we can be required to do it if we're a federal contractor. But regardless, affirmative action really does benefit organizations that have a long history of diversity problems and equal employment problems. Number 6, we'll talk a little bit about reverse discrimination and how it relates to affirmative action, and how those two concepts work together. Number 7, explain the arguments of those opposed to affirmative action and those who support it. So that's where we'll start to get into why people are against affirmative action and why people believe it's wrong, and others who support it, because when you more fully understand what the executive order is about and what its history is about, you'll understand that more deeply. And then number 8, explain the concept of valuing diversity, multiculturalism, equity, and inclusion, and why it is needed, and give examples of ways to do that. So in terms of the legal basis for doing affirmative action, first of all, we have Executive Order 11246, as you can see listed there. And that requires federal contractors to engage in affirmative action. Now, there are some constraints on specifically which federal contractors need to, which we'll get into in a bit. But the contractor will not discriminate against any employee or applicant for employment because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, again, that's part of the Civil Rights Act, right? But the contractor will also take affirmative action, which means affirmative, positive, purposeful action, to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated well during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so basically what that's arguing is we have to affirmatively decide that we're going to try to have as many applicants as we can, and then by doing that we're going to treat them fairly, pay them well, and we are going to make sure that we are attracting diverse, qualified applicants to our organization. So there's lots to it there. Below, Section 706 of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act says, if the courts find that respondents have intentionally engaged in or is currently intentionally engaging in an unlawful employment practice that is charged in a complaint, the court may enjoin the respondent from engaging in such unlawful practices and order such affirmative action as may be appropriate, which may include but is not limited to reinstatement of hiring employees or any other equitable relief as the court deems appropriate. So we see here in two points that we're required to do affirmative action. Number one, you're required to do it if you are a federal contractor with a certain size contract. And the requirements of that are you have to have 50 or more employees and a contract of $50,000 or more. And so you would become obligated to do affirmative action. And then secondarily, if you are found guilty of intentional discrimination, and the courts can order, among many remedies, but one of the things that they can order is for you to actively do affirmative action. It can be court ordered as well. So specifically, what do we mean by the term affirmative action? As I've already implied, it's intentional, purposeful inclusion of women and minorities in the workplace based on a finding of their previous exclusion. And so when we are asked to engage in affirmative action, we have to look at our numbers to see whether or not we have underrepresentation of women and minority groups in our workplace. And then that obligates us to proactively go out and improve our recruitment pool. It never tells us that we absolutely have to hire somebody who is unqualified just because we need to fill a position, right? It does require us, though, to improve our recruitment pool of people for external hiring or even for internal promotions and internal hiring. So it is important that we engage in actively, proactively attracting qualified women and minorities to apply for jobs in our company. Individuals with disabilities and vets are also covered by affirmative action provisions. And so again, we need to go out and proactively figure out how can we find veterans. There's great places to be able to do that, as well as those who have a documented disability. So we might, as long as we can, they can do the job with a reasonable accommodation, we should be able to hire, who we need to hire to be able to do that. In order to engage in affirmative action, there are a number of different things that an employer can do. Number one, expanding their outreach, recruiting groups to work or to apply for jobs with the employer, and to do this where you have to make a purposeful effort to do that. And particularly if you don't have a diverse workforce and you want to be able to improve the number of women or improve the number of minority groups or improve veterans, for example. You have to proactively find them and find tools that will enable you, or sources that will enable you, to identify those individuals and to actively bring them into the organization. All right. The second thing, we have to do better mentoring, management training, and development of traditionally excluded groups. And now this is getting at the internal hiring, right? So external, we're looking at external sources to hire people from the outside to come to our company. But the mentoring and the training and the development are looking at the pipelines and the promotional pipelines and the succession planning that goes on in our company. And given that, we are obligated under affirmative action to mentor those who have been traditionally excluded, to provide better training and development opportunities for everybody, but specifically to ensure that the underrepresented groups are having the same opportunities for development as those who have been in the majority group, the inclusive group, right? So we wanted to make sure that we're hiring and training in other attempts to bring in workplace groups that have traditionally been left out of the employment process. So, that could be a broader category where we might have non-traditional workers, people who are older. There's all sorts of different sources. But primarily what we're looking at is we're trying to expand our recruitment efforts to attract more diverse people by reaching out to places where I can source more women and minority groups, And then secondarily, making sure within my company I have a development plan or a development system in place that is inclusive and allows people who have traditionally been excluded from promotion tracks or from succession planning to be included in that, and any other sort of hiring and training attempts that need to be done. If you've ever done any research on employment and who has jobs, who does not have jobs, who has the opportunity to advance and who does not, you'll find some not so pleasant results. Fundamentally, we know from the research numbers, it's all in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? Women and minorities still lag in terms of pay, job opportunities, and promotions. There are glass ceiling issues that those groups face in terms of not getting the proper pay and not getting the proper opportunities to advance in the organization. Research does show that people who hire tend to notice value more quickly in someone who looks like them. This is a similar to me bias, right? And it is a common thing that our brains do when we see people who act like us, look like us, think like us. We tend to give them a boost in terms of how we evaluate them because they are more like us. And so we like to surround ourselves with people who are like us. But we also know when we do that, we end up with more homogeneous organizations, which creates problems for competitiveness. So we do want more heterogeneous organizations because that enables us then to be more adaptable, to be more flexible, and to have diverse ideas and diverse opinions and diverse solutions to problems. Almost 90% of jobs are filled through word of mouth, which means that if you have an organization that's already not diverse, if you're filling jobs through word of mouth, as we've discussed in the previous chapter, right? If most of those jobs are being filled by somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, then really you're just going to be perpetuating the homogeneity of your organization. You're not going to be proactively trying to make it more diverse. And that's really what affirmative action is about. It's about proactively and affirmatively going out and attracting more qualified individuals, a wider host of people. When made-up resumes were sent out in response to classified ads with only names changed to sound more or less ethnic and addresses changed to be more likely to be in predominantly Black areas, white applicants were not only more likely to be granted interviews, but interviewers tried harder to reach them. I will also tell you, I did a resume study where I had a resume of a male and a resume of a female, and it was sent out, and it was part of an investigation on whether or not if someone pretended that they were Latino when they really weren't, was that going to have an impact on their ability to be hired? I mean, regardless of that, other things that we found in our study affirmed this, that when you have identical resumes, women were ranked and evaluated lower than men were. Even with the same resume, identical resume, women were evaluated lower. Simply put, what that means is people have a bias when they look at things. And if you don't look like me, if you don't act like me, if you don't sound like me, I'm going to downgrade you and make you less likely to be hired by my organization, or even considered as a candidate. I might not even make the first cut. If I make the first cut, sometimes you can get further, but if you can't even make the first cut, this is a big problem. The glass ceiling is also a big issue. In the 1990s, Elizabeth Dole, who was the Secretary of Labor under George H.W. Bush, commissioned the glass ceiling commission, and it was from an act of Congress, and it was led by her in order for us to investigate whether or not and what are the factors around the glass ceiling for women and minorities in organizations. And this was part of the Department of Labor, and now, it started with Elizabeth Dole. It ended up with Robert Reich underneath Bill Clinton, President Clinton. And we found that white women, make up to close to half the workplace, but only 5% of senior level positions in organizations. So there was clearly a glass ceiling. So if we make up half the workforce and only 5% of us are in those top ranked positions, that means 95% of those are males, and most likely white males, although probably slightly less than that. Maybe it's like 80%. Um, so African Americans and other minorities account for less than 3% of top jobs, right? So where do we see glass ceiling issues? Most of the glass ceiling problems are in what we would consider to be masculine and male dominated fields, um, construction, wholesale, manufacturing, things like that. And we find it is incredibly difficult for women and minorities to break through that glass ceiling. Are we improving? Absolutely. Things are far more improved than they were a number of years ago, but it is still a challenge for women and minorities to break through if we are not proactively, affirmatively being mindful of the fact that it is very easy for us to hire people who only look like us, because it's the natural thing that our brain does.